18 people died when the aircraft they were flying in crashed off the end of the runway in what would be the deadliest plane crash in the history of Aspen, Colorado. And the investigation that followed revealed shocking details about the mistakes the pilot made and also what one of the passengers did that led to this terrible disaster. That's why I'm going to explain what happened on this deadly flight. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on March 29, 2001 in the town of Los Angeles, California, when two pilots, a flight attendant, and 15 passengers boarded an aircraft to begin a private charter flight to Aspen, Colorado. The passenger that paid for the charter flight was Mr. New, and he was taking 14 of his friends with him to a dinner party in Aspen, and then they were going to enjoy a weekend of skiing at the town's famous resorts. The aircraft they were flying in was a 1980 Gulfstream III, also known as a G3, a twin-engine business jet that requires two pilots and can typically carry up to 19 passengers, and at the time it was a popular choice for VIP travel. Now, before we go any further, I just want to remind everyone that these are the names of the victims in this tragedy. They were lifelong friends and family members, and together they represented a mix of Hollywood, finance, and media professionals. I also want to point out that Kathy was the flight attendant on board the plane, and she had been working for the charter company for 12 years, and my heart goes out to the family, friends, and the loved ones they all left behind. According to the investigation, the aircraft was within the weight and balance limits for the flight, and there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that would have contributed to the crash. However, the NTSB was able to use the cockpit voice recorder that was recovered from the wreckage, as well as radar data to determine exactly what happened during the final moments of the flight. But before we take a look at that, it's important to know a little bit more about the pilots that were flying the plane. The pilot flying the aircraft in the left seat was Bob, and he was the captain, and he was 44 years old. According to the investigation, he had an airline transport pilot certificate and had acquired almost 10,000 hours of total flight time, including almost 8,000 hours as the pilot in command. Now, we don't know much about his history other than the fact that in January of 1990, he got his initial type rating on the Gulfstream III, and eventually he was hired by a company called Avjet in October of 2000 to serve as a captain on the G3, and he had almost 1,500 hours of experience flying the G3 at the time of the crash. The FAA initially said there were no records of him being involved in previous accidents. However, upon further review, they discovered that in January of 1999, he was landing a G2 at an airport in Chino, California, and he went off the end of the runway, but no action was taken against him at that time, and I couldn't find any record of that mishap in the NTSB database. Either way, Bob went through recurrent ground training in November of 2000, and then he had a proficiency check ride in the G3 in December, about 3 months before the accident. And according to those that knew him, he was a good pilot. The first officer sitting next to Bob in the right seat was Peter, and he was 38 years old. Peter was hired by Avjet in November of 2000, 1 month after Bob, and according to the NTSB, Peter had about 5,500 hours of total flight time, including over 4,600 hours as a pilot in command and over 900 hours experience on the G2 and the G3. In fact, Peter had finished his check ride on the G3 with the company in February of 2001, just 1 month before the crash. According to the company director of training, Peter was sharp, knowledgeable, motivated, and handled the aircraft well. He also added that he was a great first officer. So basically, we're talking about two pilots that had a lot of experience between them, and they were both relatively new to the company, but they had been paired together for pretty much the entire 4 to 5 months since they were hired, and they had even flown to Aspen together at least 2 times prior to the accident flight. However, despite their past experience, they showed up at the airport not realizing how difficult this flight was going to be. On the morning of the flight, Bob and Peter arrived in Burbank, California to pick up the aircraft and reposition it to the Los Angeles International Airport to pick up the passengers later that afternoon. According to eyewitnesses, Bob was seen checking the Aspen weather on a computer, and he also discussed the weather with one of the company's schedulers prior to departing Burbank. Additionally, Peter also called flight service to get a weather briefing, and he was told about 3 weather advisories that were relevant to the flight, and he was also given the forecast for Aspen that was predicting 6 miles visibility with scattered clouds at 3,000 feet and broken clouds at 5,000 feet. But there was also a chance for light snow showers with reduced visibility. early. Now, if you've never been to Aspen, it's worth pointing out that some pilots consider this to be one of the most challenging airports in the country, because even though it's fairly manageable during the day with clear skies, it can be incredibly difficult in bad weather conditions, especially at night. The airport itself sits at the end of a valley surrounded by mountains, so it's basically one way in and one way out, and that means you've got to be prepared when you go in there. That's why Bob and Peter's company considered Aspen a special airport, and the charter manager would review the crew qualifications with upper management, and they might not assign a pilot to fly there if they weren't familiar with it. But remember, Bob and Peter had flown there at least twice before as a crew, so there weren't any concerns about them operating this trip, and according to the investigation, they departed Burbank around 2:40 p.m. local time, and they landed at LAX about 10 minutes later. But that's when things started to unravel. That's because their next flight to Aspen was scheduled to depart LA at 3:30 local time, and none of the passengers were at the airport yet. Now, I used to fly for a private charter company for a few months, and I'll just say that this is pretty typical. In fact, a lot of times the passengers show up at the very last minute, and it's not a big deal. Either way, Bob called the company to find out what was going on and also to discuss the weather in Aspen again, but the real problem was that they were running out of time. The flight from LA to Aspen was scheduled to take about an hour and 35 minutes, but you also lose an hour because of the time zone change going east. That meant if Bob and Peter took off at 3:30 local time, it would be about 6 p.m. when they landed in Aspen. The reason this is important is because the aircraft they were flying is considered a Stage 2 aircraft when it comes to noise, with Stage 1 being the loudest and Stage 4 being the quietest. And the problem was Aspen had a restriction in place that prevented Stage 2 aircraft from landing at night in order to help limit the noise disturbance to the town. This is where you also need to understand that according to regulations, nighttime begins at the end of evening civil twilight, which technically is when the center of the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon. But to keep things simple for pilots, that's 30 minutes after sunset, and because sunset was going to be at 6:28 p.m., that meant the curfew at Aspen began at 6:58 p.m. Remember, they're supposed to land at 6 p.m., and I realize that might seem like a lot of time, but here's what the NTSB final report didn't tell you. The original plan was for Bob and Peter to land in Aspen and drop off the passengers, and then they were going to fly back to Burbank, and that meant they had to be airborne out of Aspen before 6:58 p.m. So there really wasn't much room to delay the flight, and that's why Bob was starting to get concerned when he didn't see the passengers at the airport. So Bob called the company again to get some guidance, and he even talked to another pilot who confirmed with him that the curfew was 30 minutes after sunset, but they didn't discuss in detail what Bob was going to do. When it comes to the passengers, Avjet claimed they had written confirmation from the charter customer that the flight was supposed to leave at 3:30, and if they weren't airborne by 3:45, then they couldn't go to Aspen, and the only other option would be to land at the airport in Rifle, Colorado, and the passengers would have to make the 90-minute drive from there to get to Aspen. So basically, there ends up being this back and forth between Bob, the company, and a guy named David, who was the personal assistant for Mr. New, the charter customer. And what happened next is that 3:30 rolled around and the passengers still hadn't showed up. That's when Avjet called David to find out what was going on, and they discovered that all of the passengers, except for Mr. New, were just hanging out in the airport parking lot, so they told them to go ahead and get on the plane. Meanwhile, David got a hold of Mr. New, his boss, and he told him the news that the plane might have to divert if they take off late, which made Mr. New irate, and he told David to call Avjet back and tell them that the airplane wasn't going to be redirected, that he had flown into Aspen at night, and he was going to do it again. Eventually, around 4 p.m., Mr. New finally showed up at the aircraft, and when he found out that one of the pilots had already told the passengers that they might not be able to land in Aspen, Mr. New told David to call Avjet and relay a message that the pilot should keep his comments to himself. Hopefully, you're starting to get a sense of the pressure that Bob and Peter were about to face to make this flight happen. They had only been working for Avjet for a few months, and now they had to deal with a situation like this. Either way, the company worked it out so that Mr. New would pay for the plane to stay overnight in Aspen, and that way they had a little bit more time, but they still had to land before nighttime at 6:58 p.m. According to the NTSB, they took off from LA at 4:11 p.m. local time, 41 minutes later than planned, and they weren't expected to land in Aspen until 6:46 p.m., which was after sunset, but that was still 12 minutes before the curfew started. Unfortunately, the curfew would turn out to be the least of their worries. The first hour and 20 minutes of the flight out of LA was relatively uneventful, and around 6:30 p.m. local time in Aspen, Bob got a hold of the scheduler Avjet to let her know that they'd be landing in about 20 to 25 minutes. The scheduler asked if the passengers were upset, and Bob said no, but it was important to land in Aspen because Mr. New had spent a lot of money on dinner. This is a copy of the cockpit voice recorder, and the timestamps are based on the local time in Aspen, and right from the beginning we can see Bob and Peter talking about sunset and confirming with each other that they knew they had until 6:58 p.m. to make it to Aspen. About 6 minutes later, Peter was finishing up his descent checklist, and he called for the crew briefing, but all Bob said was, "We're probably going to make it a visual, and if we don't get the airport in sight, we'll go ahead and shoot that approach." And then he said, "We're not going to have a bunch of extra gas, so only get to shoot it once, and then we're going to rifle." Okay, just to be clear, I don't care how many times you've flown into an airport before, that's not how you brief an approach, especially one as complicated as the one going into Aspen. And also especially when you know that you've only got one shot to make it happen. Just so you can see what I'm talking about, this is a copy of the VOR DME Charlie approach that Bob and Peter were going to fly into Aspen. You start at the red table VOR, and there are multiple altitude restrictions you have to comply with as you get closer to the airport. That's because you're flying over all these mountains, and when you cross over the ridgeline near Alex, which is the final approach fix, you've still got to lose about 4,500 feet of altitude and 6.4 miles. That's about 700 feet per nautical mile, which is more than twice the standard gradient of 300 feet per mile. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because even though this approach is within 16 degrees of the runway centerline, it's considered a circling approach because of how steep it is. And the reason this is important is because 2 days before this tragedy, the FAA published a notice to airmen that said circling minimums were no longer authorized at night when flying into Aspen. But the thing is, Peter was provided this information when he got his weather briefing earlier in the day. However, it's not clear if he mentioned it to Bob, and he didn't ask for the briefer to clarify. And unfortunately, the truth is that what the FAA meant to say was that because this is a circling approach, the entire procedure isn't authorized at night. Regardless, if everything went according to plan, this wasn't going to be a factor. But there's still a lot more to the story, and that brings us to the approach. Before we talk about what happened next, I want you to imagine this. You go online and you find a website that already knows your phone number, your home address, even the names of your family members. As shocking as that might sound, that's exactly what data brokers are doing right now. They legally collect this kind of personally identifiable information, and then they sell it to anyone willing to pay for it. That's a huge problem, and it opens the door to scams, harassment, and even the risk of identity theft. That's why I use DeleteMe and why I recommend them to anyone who cares about keeping their personal information private. DeleteMe's team of privacy experts constantly works to track down your data on hundreds of data broker sites and then get it removed. When you sign up, you get regular privacy reports that shows exactly what they found. For me, that's been everything from my address to information about my wife and other relatives. And in the world we live in today, it's unsettling knowing that that information is being sold online. What I also like is how thorough DeleteMe is and how they keep monitoring these sites to remove your data if it shows up again. So if you're ready to take control of your privacy, check out DeleteMe. You can get 20% off all consumer plans by scanning the QR code on the screen or by going to joindeleteme.com/debrief and using code debrief at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/debrief, code debrief. Thanks again to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the story. Around 6:40 p.m., Peter got the latest weather update at Aspen, and he told Bob the winds were 320 at 4 knots with 10 miles visibility, scattered clouds at 2,000, and a broken layer at 5,500 and also at 9,000. A few minutes later, they heard another aircraft on the radio performing the missed approach procedure and requesting to do one more approach into Aspen. Peter said, "I hope he's doing practice approaches," but the controller verified the aircraft actually went missed approach and also said there were 2 other aircraft in front of them inbound for Aspen. Okay, first of all, this should have been a huge wake-up call for Bob and Peter, and they should have taken at least a few minutes to review the approach as well as the missed approach procedure. Instead, all Peter said is, "That's no good." And Bob asked, "Where's the highway? Can we get down in there? Can you see?" Probably hoping that they can just look outside and find the field and fly the approach visually. But the problem is there's too many clouds. And for the next 30 seconds, there's a little bit more discussion between them as they were trying to find the airport, but they weren't really having much luck. Keep in mind that this is probably one of the most critical segments of the flight because you're trying to get everything situated for the approach, you're assessing the weather, you're talking to the controller, and you're verifying that the aircraft is doing what you want it to do. That's why there are sterile cockpit rules that prohibit non-essential conversations or activities when you're below 10,000 feet unless you're in cruise flight. You just don't need any distractions during that time. Unfortunately, right now, Kathy is heard in the cockpit asking the pilots if they're scared. And Bob said, "I'm hoping we make it, somebody just went missed." Kathy responded, "I don't want to hear that. Why didn't you just say no, I'm not scared?" And Bob replied, "Well, I'm not scared." Now let me just say that scared probably isn't the right word for it. And I still remember the first time that I flew into Aspen and I was a little bit nervous because I knew we were going to have to deal with some bad weather. But that was a good thing. And that's why I spent a lot of time during the cruise portion of the flight reviewing the approach. Now in full transparency, Bob and Peter are still above 10,000 feet right now. However, they're getting set up for the approach, so they should have just asked Kathy to leave the cockpit so they could focus on flying the aircraft. Instead, they kind of brushed aside the concern, repeating that they aren't scared, while Bob tried to explain how they don't have enough gas to hang around and they might have to go to rifle. Right around the same time, the approach controller got on the radio and told everyone that the last aircraft inbound to Aspen was able to pick up the field visually at 1,400 feet and landed. So I think that gave Bob a little bit of confidence about the weather conditions. Now this image shows you the radar data of the flight as they approach from the southwest, and around 6:47 p.m., after the controller had said that, Bob replied saying, "I can almost see up the canyon from here, but I don't know the terrain well enough or I'd take the visual." Basically, Bob was saying, look, even with all these clouds, if I knew the terrain a little bit better, I'd find a way to make the visual approach happen. And now you're starting to get a sense of how committed he was to flying a visual approach instead of taking the time to brief and fly the instrument approach procedure. And what's ironic to me is that right after Bob said that, Peter said to him, "Remember that crazy guy in this Learjet when we were on the ground in Aspen last time and he was like, 'I see the airport,' but he couldn't see it?" Now, based on that last statement, I think it's possible that Peter might not have been comfortable with the situation, but he just wasn't willing to say anything about it. Instead, a few seconds later, Bob said that he could see the highway, and Peter asked him if he wanted to get set up on the approach. A few minutes later, there was more discussion between Bob, Kathy, and Peter, once again talking about the situation and how they've only got enough fuel to try the approach one time and then they're going to rifle. That turned into more talk from Kathy about how she didn't bring her pajamas, but at least she has her makeup and she's gonna have to go buy liquor because the passengers drank everything. Now don't take that the wrong way. I'm not blaming Kathy for anything that happened. It's the captain's job to set the tone and tell her that if she's gonna ride in the jump seat, then she needs to be quiet. Or perhaps don't even let her sit in the jump seat when you're getting vectored to fly a challenging approach in the weather. Regardless, about 30 seconds later, the controller gave them a heading to fly, and they turned to the northeast to begin the approach, and Kathy left the cockpit to make sure the passengers were buckled in. In the meantime, Bob and Peter started configuring the aircraft, and Peter also started reading off some items on the checklist, but then there was some confusion, and every minute that passed by, you can feel them falling further behind the aircraft. That's when the controller said, "Attention all aircraft. Last aircraft went missed approach." Peter's response, "That's not good." Just think about this for a second. You're about to fly an approach at night, in the weather, surrounded by the mountains, and you hear the aircraft out in front of you going missed approach, but you haven't briefed the approach or the missed approach procedure. And if that wasn't enough, the flight attendant shows up in the cockpit again. This time she brought one of the passengers with her and helped him buckle in, and then she said, "Oh shoot, can he sit here?" Almost like she didn't want to ask the pilot's permission, and instead she was going to let Bob and Peter be the ones to say no. However, Bob and Peter were so busy trying to configure the aircraft and talk to the controller that they just kind of ignored her. And I mean, that has to be the worst possible time to bring a passenger up to the cockpit. And although there wasn't any way to prove it, multiple sources suggest that it was most likely Mr. New, the charter customer, that was now sitting in the jump seat. At this point, they were 5 miles from Red Table and told to cross Red Table at or above 14,000, and they were cleared for the approach. And this image shows you their flight path in blue with all the altitudes they needed to comply with on the approach. As they continued their descent, they checked in with the tower and were asked if they had the airport in sight, but they still couldn't see it. The tower controller told them they were following a Challenger aircraft and they were cleared to land on runway 15. But then a few seconds later, the Challenger aircraft said they didn't have the runway in sight, so they were going around. And if you're keeping track, that's 3 airplanes now that have gone missed approach because of the weather. And Bob and Peter still haven't even mentioned to each other the possibility that they might have to fly the missed approach. As the situation grew more intense, the man sitting in the jump seat asked Bob, "Are we clear?" And Bob said, "Not yet, he just missed. The guy in front of us didn't make it either." And right after that, he asked Peter what the next altitude restriction was. Once again, this was a huge distraction, and no one should be sitting up front trying to talk to the pilots right now. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very challenging approach when you're flying it in the weather, and it takes a lot of concentration, but also really good crew coordination. In fact, according to the company operations manual, Peter was responsible for making several callouts during the approach to include when they got to their minimums, as well as calling for the missed approach if the runway wasn't in sight, but as you're about to see, none of that happened. Now, I'll admit that things seemed to be on track initially, and they were meeting the altitude requirements on the approach, but as soon as they got to Alex, everything started to unravel. That's because they weren't supposed to go lower than 10,400 feet until they were 9.5 miles from Red Table, but instead Bob dove down to 10,100 feet and then he leveled off for about 10 seconds. Alright, first of all, he's already below the minimum descent altitude, and Peter's job as the pilot monitoring was to call that out, because you're not supposed to go lower than the MDA unless you have the runway environment in sight. And I think this just goes to show you how unprepared they were for this approach. As Bob started to level off, he said, "Okay, I'm breaking out." And then he asked the tower if the lights were turned all the way up. Now I would interpret breaking out to mean he can see the airfield and he's going to fly visually the rest of the way. But I think he just had visual contact with the ground below, but he didn't clarify his words or tell Peter or the tower that he had the runway in sight. And what you don't see in this image is that at this point, Bob began a 15-degree turn to the right, and he asked Peter if he could see the runway or the highway. Just for comparison, I'm going to let this play while I explain what's going on here, because this was taken during a daytime flight in the weather going into Aspen, and I want you to let me know when you see the runway. The highway that they're talking about is the one that you can see angling in from the left from the bottom of the screen, and then it starts to lead towards the runway. And as they're flying this approach, Peter said he could see the highway, and 2 seconds later, the tower asked if they had the runway in sight, and both pilots said yes, they had the runway in sight. Now imagine this was all pitch black, because now it's nighttime, and I hope you're getting a sense for how difficult this approach can be. And if you haven't found it yet, here's the runway, but chances are Bob and Peter never saw it. And just to be clear, having the highway in sight doesn't mean you have the runway in sight. Now perhaps they thought they saw the runway, but I'd argue that they saw the highway and Bob was just hoping to follow that visually. Bob continued the descent and they were about 900 feet below the altitude that they should have been at when they were at 9.5 DME, which is about 3 miles from the runway. And once again, there's no discussion in the cockpit about the fact that they're below the MDA right now and they still don't have the runway in sight. Oh, and by the way, the local time is now 7:01 p.m., which was 3 minutes after the nighttime restriction began. But the thing you need to realize about the curfew is that when you're flying into Aspen, even though the sunset was at 6:28 p.m., because of the mountains, the actual sunset time was 25 minutes earlier, and nighttime began around 6:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes prior to the crash. Also, remember how the NOTAM said that circling minimums weren't authorized at night? Well, the Aspen controller never got a copy of that NOTAM. And it's just tragic, because if they did, then perhaps the controller never would have cleared them for the approach. Regardless, they continued the approach, and Peter said, "To the right is good," presumably letting Bob know they weren't going to hit the mountains to the right of them, and according to a weather observation, they had been in and out of the clouds for most of the approach, and the visibility was down to about 2 miles due to the light snow showers. A few seconds later, Peter called out 1,000 to go, and as they continued descending, Bob said, "Where's it at?" While at the same time, the aircraft continued turning to the right to a heading of about 200 degrees when they were only 600 feet off the ground. Bob deployed the spoilers and reduced the engine power to 55%, probably in an effort to get down as quickly as possible below the weather so he could see the runway. However, the aircraft manual prohibits spoiler use when you have the landing gear extended or the flaps in the landing configuration. And also the power setting on final wasn't supposed to be less than 64% in order to meet go-around standards. This was just one more reason for Peter to call for the go-around or for Bob to realize, as the captain of the flight, that what they were doing was unsafe and he should have just started the go-around himself. Instead, for some reason, Peter called out to the right and Bob replied to the right. It's not clear if Peter meant for Bob to turn right or if he was just saying terrain was to the right. Either way, they were now at least 50 degrees off runway heading and passing through 500 feet when they got the first sink rate warning. My guess is that both pilots at this point were focused on looking outside trying to find the runway, and neither of them were monitoring their altitude, airspeed, or how far they've deviated to the right of course. As they passed through 400 feet, the aircraft banked 10 degrees left wing down, and then 10 seconds later they got a bank angle alert as the bank angle exceeded 40 degrees left wing down, possibly because Bob saw the runway at the last minute and was making a desperate attempt to correct course, but unfortunately they were too low and too slow, and the left wing clipped a tree and they slammed into the ground, resulting in the aircraft breaking apart and killing everyone on board. This was an absolutely terrible tragedy, and the reason I titled this video Pilot versus Passenger is because I'd argue that the pressure from Mr. New to make the flight happen led to Bob and Peter making some really bad decisions during the flight that seemed to be out of character for them. However, just to be clear, I'm not blaming the passenger. It's the job of the pilot in command to ensure the safety of the flight, and that means you've got to be willing to tell the passenger no when you need to, and there were plenty of opportunities for Bob or Peter to speak up during the flight and stop this from happening. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to support the channel, be sure to check out this other video on your screen. Thanks again to DME-C for sponsoring this video. To start removing your data from broker sites, check out the link in the description below to save 20%.